She boarded quietly, a black woman in understated slacks and a pressed navy blouse, her steps composed, her eyes focused. She carried no extravagance, just a soft leather satchel, and the kind of presence that made people glance but rarely greet. From the moment she stepped into first class, something shifted, not in her, but around her. Eyes narrowed, smirks formed. A steward blocked her path to the bathroom with a smirk and a single sentence that would unravel everything. What followed wasn't just a series of slights. It was a slow, deliberate crucifixion at 36,000 feet. And none of them knew who they were dealing with. This isn't just a story about travel. It's about perception, power, and the moment truth lands harder than turbulence. If you're watching this, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment. What do you think is really happening here? And tell us, where are you tuning in from? You're going to want to stay with this story. Every moment builds toward something they never saw coming. Dr. Ayanna Whitlow's heels clicked softly on the jet bridge as she boarded the aircraft, her boarding pass neatly folded in her left hand, the same one that had once held pressure against shattered arteries, crushed tracheas, collapsed lungs. She wasn't dressed in her usual trauma greens today. No. Tonight she wore tailored slate gray slacks and a cream blouse beneath a charcoal blazer. Nothing flashy, nothing loud, but crisp, intentional. Like her, she'd booked this red-eye to San Diego in first class not for comfort or status, but because she had only 4 hours between landing and stepping onto the stage as the opening speaker at the National Symposium for Trauma Response. This speech, this summit, was not just another conference. It was the pinnacle. Years of research, fieldwork in crisis zones, hundreds of hours spent studying transport logistics for mass casualty events had led to this. And all she needed now was rest, quiet, time to seal her thoughts before she delivered what she hoped would redefine disaster medicine protocols across the country. She took seat 2A, stowed her leather satchel, and placed her carry-on overhead. The man in 2B, middle-aged, graying, and polite, gave a silent nod which she returned before settling in. Her body ached slightly from the long hospital shift earlier that day. She closed her eyes. Breathe in, breathe out. She would get up, use the restroom, return, sleep. That was all. She unfastened her belt and stood, adjusting the sleeve of her blazer. "Ma'am." The voice was sharp, immediate. She turned. A flight attendant, tall, white, red lipstick drawn with military precision, stood at the front galley with her arms crossed like a sentry. Her name tag read Christine. "That lavatory is for crew and premium passengers only." Ayanna blinked. "I'm seated in 2A, she said quietly, gesturing behind her. "Still, that one's not available. Use the one at the back." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. Ayanna heard everything between them. "Not for you. Not your place, not your right." Her pulse ticked faster. She opened her mouth to respond, but stopped. From the corner of her eye, she caught movement. A white woman in yoga pants and a fluffy pink neck pillow strolled past her and the attendant without a glance. Christine didn't stop her, didn't speak. The woman smiled absently, tapped her phone, and disappeared into the lavatory. Ayanna stood still, frozen by the sharp dissonance of it. Christine's eyes remained on Ayanna, stone set. She stepped back, said nothing. Her walk to the economy bathroom was slow, each step deliberate. Eyes followed her, curious, puzzled. A man in 3C leaned into the aisle slightly to see what was going on. A teenage girl pulled her earbuds out to look. No one said a word. She passed the curtain that separated first from coach like it was a border she'd crossed illegally. The economy lavatory was predictably cramped, dull, fluorescent lit, and smelled faintly of ammonia. She washed her hands slowly, deliberately, trying to hold on to the feeling of control. It slipped away like water down the drain. She looked up into the mirror. Her own reflection looked tired, more than tired, weary. There was nothing on her face but quiet disbelief. Her title didn't matter here. Her credentials irrelevant. Her seat insignificant. She was simply another ma'am, whose presence disturbed the equilibrium of power. Returning to her seat, she noticed Christine handing bottled water to the white woman who had just used the forbidden lavatory. Ayana's cup was now gone. No replacement. She sat down. No one met her eyes. Not Christine, not her seatmate, not the passengers around her who had seen it all and decided to let it happen. Her chest tightened, not with anger, not yet, but with something colder, resignation. How many times had she been made to swallow these microaggressions? How often had she been told in subtle and overt ways that she was out of place? Every breath she took was measured, every blink purposeful. The humiliation hadn't passed. It lingered, clinging to her skin like cigarette smoke, settling in places she couldn't scrub clean with logic or professionalism. She tried to remind herself why she was on this flight, why she'd spent weeks refining her keynote address, why she had earned the right to be there in seat 2A, not just with her wallet, but with her years of sacrifice, knowledge, and grit. But the words she would have spoken to encourage herself felt distant, stripped of comfort. The plane had not yet taken off. Passengers were still organizing their bags, still checking their devices, still pretending not to notice the incident they had clearly witnessed. Ayana stared blankly at the seat back in front of her, her mind drifting through memories she thought she'd left behind. The colleague who once suggested she must have been a diversity hire, the patient's family who asked to speak to the real doctor, the mentor who told her to never appear angry or they'll shut the door in your face. All of them, like ghosts, pulled up by one short exchange in an airplane cabin. A second attendant approached, this one younger, male, and with a clipboard tucked under his arm. He paused at her row, adjusted the collar of his uniform, and glanced at Christine, who stood again near the front lavatory. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Ayana, but not looking her in the eyes, "I'm going to need you to remain seated until we're in the air." His voice was louder than necessary, just enough to draw the attention of the man across the aisle who looked up from his phone, and the couple in row 1 who subtly turned their heads. Ayana blinked, caught off guard. "I didn't ask to move," she said quietly, confused. He nodded, avoiding her eyes again. "Just standard protocol, okay? We can't have any passengers crowding the front galley pre-takeoff." She realized too late that Christine had probably relayed her earlier bathroom visit as a disruption. She opened her mouth to protest, but stopped herself. What would be the point? She had already been labeled a troublemaker, a disruption. Just as the announcement to secure cabin doors began overhead, Ayana watched Christine guide a white-haired man with a cane slowly toward the same lavatory she'd been denied moments ago. He was in 3A, she noted, behind her. Not first class by any definition. But Christine smiled warmly, even placing a gentle hand on his elbow as she held the door open. Ayana inhaled sharply, a short, silent breath. Her stomach coiled. The hypocrisy wasn't subtle, it was deliberate. A moment later, the younger male steward returned. His voice echoed, just loud enough to carry 2 rows in every direction. "Economy restrooms available, ma'am. If you need it again." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a courtesy. It was a directive. And it was public. Several passengers looked up. One woman blinked in surprise, then turned her eyes quickly back to her tablet. A man in 1D adjusted his watch, clearly uncomfortable. Ayana felt heat rush up her chest to her neck, not from embarrassment, but from the rage she refused to let surface. She turned to the window. The night sky beyond the tarmac was pitch black. Her reflection stared back at her, composed, silent, simmering. Her mind screamed, "Do something. Say something. Demand the respect you've earned." But her mouth remained shut. Her hands remained still. She had walked through too many boardrooms where one raised brow, one clipped word, would be twisted into aggression. And the stakes here were no different. The man beside her in 2B cleared his throat awkwardly, as though wanting to say something but fearing the cost of involvement. He settled deeper into his seat. The plane taxied. The engines growled to life. The cabin dimmed. Ayana leaned her head back and closed her eyes, but her pulse beat fast and hard in her throat. She thought of her parents, her mother's iron insistence that grace was survival, her father's warnings that the world would never see her achievements before they saw her skin. They had prepared her for moments like this. They hadn't wanted to. They had just known better. The plane lifted off. And as the pressure changed in her ears, something else shifted in her chest, a cold, familiar ache that told her this wasn't an isolated experience. It was a pattern, a cycle, one that had just repeated again at 36,000 feet. The announcement had been loud, intentional, and it had marked her like a scarlet letter. A black woman in first class, singled out and redirected like she was trying to sneak in, not someone who had paid for her seat and earned her status 1,000 times over. Her temples throbbed with silent fury, but her expression didn't betray it. She had trained herself to appear unbothered, to compress every feeling into a quiet nod, to turn humiliation into elegance. The flight attendants had moved on, performing their duties as if nothing had occurred. But Ayanna could feel the residual energy in the air. The sting of judgment lingered on her skin, invisible yet all-consuming. She tried to return to her notes, opening her satchel with the grace of someone attempting to reclaim normalcy. But as she reached inside for her planner, her fingers brushed against something cold. Her metal ID badge clipped to the inner pocket. Trauma Chief, Boston Medical Center. It was ironic. She could lead a team through mass casualty triage in the middle of a collapsed building. But here in this leather seat above the clouds, she had no power. She decided to go to the restroom again, not out of urgency, but because she needed space, a moment to reset before her body betrayed her by trembling. As she rose and turned toward the back of the plane, she kept her steps measured and her face forward. She didn't glance at Christine or the younger steward. She didn't give them the satisfaction. 10 minutes later, Ayanna returned to her row. The cabin lights had dimmed slightly, casting a warm glow that masked the low murmurs of passengers settling in with drinks and movies. But as she approached her seat, she stopped short. Her heart paused, then dropped. Someone else was in 2A. A woman, white mid-50s, with perfectly coiffed blonde hair, was reclined in her seat, tapping on her phone. Ayanna's leather satchel had been pushed to the floor and rested near the aisle, its corner slightly bent, its zipper half open. A chill swept through her limbs. She stepped forward, calmly but firmly, and said, "Excuse me, I believe you're in my seat." The woman looked up, blinked once, and replied in a tone laced with irritation, "I was told this seat was unclaimed." Ayanna's eyes shifted to the flight attendant standing a few rows away. It wasn't Christine this time, but another crew member she hadn't interacted with. He approached slowly, hands clasped in front of him, his smile tight and rehearsed. "I thought you had moved to coach, ma'am," he said. Ayanna's brow furrowed. "No, I didn't. I went to the restroom. My belongings were here." He gave a slight shrug, as if the incident were an unfortunate inconvenience rather than an affront. "We weren't sure you were coming back," he said. "No one asked," Ayanna replied, her voice low but precise. The woman in her seat finally stood, brushing imaginary lint off her blazer before picking up her designer tote and sliding into the seat behind. She didn't apologize, didn't meet Ayanna's eyes. Ayanna crouched down, retrieved her satchel, and placed it back on the seat beside her, checking to ensure nothing had been taken or damaged. Her heart pounded, not from confrontation, but from the sick familiarity of this kind of erasure. She sat down again, buckled in, and tried to center herself. Her skin felt hot. Her scalp tingled. She adjusted her sleeves, touched her badge again. "Remember who you are," she told herself. But before she could fully settle, a voice behind her pierced the air, low but audible. "Uppity." The word landed like a slap. Ayanna turned her head slightly. A man in 3C, the same one who had stared earlier, was now sipping wine and smirking. He didn't bother to whisper. The attendant who had assisted the woman from her seat gave a soft chuckle under his breath and turned toward his coworker, muttering just loudly enough to be heard, "Entitled ones are the worst." Ayanna gripped the armrests, her teeth clenched behind closed lips. She didn't turn around. She didn't demand names or apologies. The reactions were too casual, too comfortable. They had done this before, to others who didn't have her platform or poise. The word uppity still echoed like a sharp whistle in her ears, and though she hadn't turned, hadn't flinched, the memory of it burned fresh with every breath. She had thought that might be the end of it, but the atmosphere in the cabin hadn't reset. If anything, it grew thicker, tainted by the invisible smog of scrutiny and unsaid justifications. The attendants moved past her row quickly now, ignoring her presence with surgical precision, like she was a note in the margin they had been told to skip. She stared straight ahead, blinking slowly, trying to return to her preparation for tomorrow's keynote, but the words on her notepad looked foreign, their meaning severed from focus. The patient flow data she had memorized now bled into images of the flight attendant chuckling at her expense, of her belongings scattered on the floor like clutter in a space she had paid to occupy. 10 minutes passed, then 15. When the attendants returned with beverage carts, Ayanna waited, expecting to be skipped again, and she was. They served rows 1 and 3, not 2. The male steward didn't even glance her way. Her mouth had gone dry, her lips chapped from the recycled cabin air, and though she didn't want to ask for anything, not from them, not now, her body refused to remain complicit. She pressed the call button above her seat once, then again. A quiet amber glow above her head blinked into the aisle. She waited. No one came. After a full 5 minutes, Christine appeared, arms folded tight against her navy uniform. "Yes?" she asked, her tone devoid of hospitality. Ayanna inhaled and spoke carefully. "I'd like to file a formal complaint regarding earlier incidents." Christine raised a brow and tilted her head slightly, not in confusion, but in patronizing curiosity. "About what exactly?" "The restroom denial, the seat being taken, the public announcement directing me to economy," Ayanna said evenly, her voice low but firm. "The comments made by crew and passengers." Christine narrowed her eyes and gave a tight smile that didn't reach them. "Ma'am, if you're going to make this into something bigger than it is, I need to warn you now. We will have you removed upon landing." The words hung there, cold, heavy. Ayanna blinked slowly, stunned. "You're threatening to have me removed for requesting to file a complaint." Christine straightened. "I'm informing you that causing disruptions on a flight is a serious issue, and crew safety is our top priority. If you continue escalating, we will consider it grounds for intervention." It was not a conversation. It was a warning wrapped in authority, sealed with condescension. The message was clear: be quiet or be punished. Ayanna sat back. Her hand was still poised mid-air, as though her words had left a physical weight. She lowered it slowly. Every instinct told her to remain calm, to document everything later. But silence here, again, felt like complicity. She'd been silent for every humiliation up to this point. Every ignored call light. Every micro-cut. Now they were saying her silence should continue, or else. The man in 2B, who had remained quiet throughout the flight, suddenly turned. His brow furrowed, his voice calm but clear. "That's ridiculous. She's not being disruptive." Christine's head snapped in his direction. "Sir, this doesn't concern you." "I think it does," he replied, sitting up straighter. "I've been watching. She hasn't done anything wrong. She asked for water and to file a complaint. That's not grounds for removal." Christine's lips curled into a smile that was both thin and dangerous. "Sir, I'm going to advise you now to stay in your lane. This is a matter between crew and passenger." Her tone was precise, clipped, the kind that masked disdain behind a mask of policy. The man seemed taken aback. He opened his mouth to argue but paused. Perhaps he saw what Ayanna had seen all along. This wasn't about rules. It was about control. And when control was threatened, consequences came swiftly. Christine turned and walked off, her heels clicking in even rhythm, the sound crisp in the cabin's otherwise hushed tension. Ayanna turned to the man beside her and offered a silent nod. She didn't thank him aloud. She couldn't. Not yet. The gesture would mark him too. In this kind of environment, decency had a cost. She reached into her bag and pulled out her notepad again, not to review trauma data, but to quietly document everything. Names, times, words. This wasn't over. She'd make sure of it. She thought of her students back in Boston, the residents she mentored, the young black women who looked to her not just as a doctor, but as proof that it could be done, that they belonged. What would she tell them about this night? About the line between professionalism and submission? About the price of being silent to stay seated? She didn't speak to her seatmate, though his attempt to defend her had briefly sparked some semblance of humanity in the hollow of this aircraft. But the damage had already been done. Her trust in the crew had eroded completely. The safety briefings she'd half listened to before now rang in her head, absurdly ironic. Your crew is here for your safety and comfort. What comfort? Whose safety? Certainly not hers. The service cart clinked and rattled as it rolled closer again. The scent of warmed pretzels and coffee filtered forward from the back. Christine and the young male steward had switched aisles. She kept her eyes low, pretending to read something on her screen, but in truth, she was watching from the corner of her vision. Row 1 received their meals. Then 2B, her seatmate, was handed a tray. The steward glanced at her, but kept moving, pushing past 2A, as if it were empty. Ayanna waited. Perhaps it was an oversight. Perhaps they were circling back. Minutes passed. The cart continued toward row 3. Nothing. Ayanna leaned toward the aisle slightly, her voice quiet, firm, yet laced with weariness. "Excuse me, could I at least have a bottle of water?" The young steward stopped briefly, turned to face her, then without a word bent over the cart, snatched a bottle, twisted the cap, and extended it toward her. But as she reached for it, he let go prematurely. The bottle slipped from his hand and fell onto her lap. The cap hadn't been secured properly, and cold water splashed across her slacks and blouse. She gasped slightly, more from shock than discomfort, and reflexively brushed at the spreading, wet patch. The steward didn't apologize. He simply blinked once, said oops, and turned away without waiting to see the result. Christine, further up the aisle, snorted softly and covered it with a cough. The silence that followed was deafening. Her seatmate turned toward her, alarm clear on his face, but Ayanna shook her head before he could speak. "Don't," she whispered. She didn't want him to say anything, not because it wasn't warranted, but because she couldn't bear to see him silenced again. She reached down and pulled a napkin from her bag, gently blotting her lap. The water had seeped through to her blouse, darkening the fabric near her waist. She felt cold now, not just from the liquid, but from the humiliation that had crashed over her like a second wave. She sat soaked, silent, and dismissed. In all her years of practice of surviving hospital politics and high-pressure field trauma units, she had never been treated with such casual cruelty. It was systematic, choreographed, a performance of power. And as if the universe sensed her moment of lowest endurance, a child's voice rang out from across the aisle. "Mommy, why is she sitting up here?" The words weren't malicious, just curious, but they landed like a blade. The child couldn't have been more than 6, perched beside his mother in row 3D. His voice was loud enough to slice through the rows. "She's not dressed like the other people," he added innocently. His mother hushed him quickly, whispered something Ayanna couldn't hear, but she didn't correct him. She didn't explain the context or the wrongdoing. She didn't say she belongs here too. No one said anything. Not a steward, not a fellow passenger, not a soul. The silence was worse than the question, worse than the water, worse than the insults. It meant they all heard it and silently agreed. Ayanna turned back toward the window, jaw clenched so tightly that her temples ached. She counted her breaths. 1, 2, 3. She imagined herself in the trauma bay, sterile lights overhead, nurses barking vitals, and her own voice steady, focused. That was the world she knew. That was the world she had earned. Not this one, where her presence triggered curiosity at best, contempt at worst. A world where her silence had become a survival tactic rather than a strategic choice. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her notepad again, the leather cover now damp. She flipped to a fresh page and began to write. Not case notes, not speech points, just facts. Flight number, names, descriptions, exact times, comments. She wrote with the precision of a surgeon because she needed to hold on to something real, something grounded in truth. She didn't know what she would do with it yet. She didn't have a plan, but recording it made her feel less erased. For a moment, she reclaimed authorship of her own experience. Her seatmate offered her a clean napkin, which she accepted without a word. He didn't speak again, and she was grateful. Even empathy could feel like exposure. The rest of the cabin had returned to their routines. Some scrolled through tablets. Others sipped wine or nodded off to sleep. No one else seemed to care that a passenger had been soaked by a crew member, had been publicly questioned by a child, and had spent the flight enduring invisible cuts no airline policy would ever account for. The seatbelt light remained off, the flight smooth and uneventful in the eyes of every other traveler on board. But for Ayanna, each second ticked with the gravity of insult upon insult. She no longer expected this flight to be peaceful. She no longer believed her silence was protection. It had only made her invisible. Yet, even invisibility had its use. People revealed their true nature when they thought you didn't matter. And now Ayanna realized she could use that. She reached slowly into her satchel and withdrew her phone. The screen illuminated her face faintly in the dim light of the cabin. Her fingers didn't tremble. There was no erratic movement, no angry tapping or shaking hands. She typed with the same calm precision she used in an operating room, measured, exacting, cold. She opened a secure messaging app used for confidential business communications. The recipient field autofilled with a name, G.C. Langley. She paused for 1 second before writing the subject line. Her lips pressed into a firm line. Then she typed it clearly, unequivocally, escalate. Discrimination Flight 714 manifest. Confirm capture. She attached a timestamp, a seat number, a quick list of incident tags, obstruction, targeting, harassment, neglect, all in capital letters. Then she sent it. A tiny notification confirmed delivery. There was no fanfare, no change in the ambient hum of the aircraft. Yet Ayanna felt something subtle shift. Not outside, but within. It was the first deliberate act she had made since boarding that resembled resistance. Not confrontation, not noise, strategy. She wasn't just a passenger. She was the senior compliance executive for Blue Wave Medical Systems, a corporate entity that held a significant minority stake in 3 airline health partnerships, including the one operating this very aircraft. She wasn't someone who posted online to seek outrage. She didn't have to. Her authority operated in a different realm, quiet, deliberate, and backed by policy. What she initiated now would not create a storm on social media. It would bring legal inquiry, review panels, and internal audits. It would trigger protocols, not hashtags. She returned the phone to her lap and folded her hands again. Her breathing had slowed. Her heart was still pounding, not from fear, but from the precision of taking back control. Every insult until now had been buried beneath dignity and restraint, but now she had moved. Quietly, unseen, and it felt like reclaiming oxygen. The steward passed her row again, eyes forward, expression blank. She didn't acknowledge him, and he didn't dare glance down. Her seatmate noticed the flicker of her phone screen, but said nothing. Perhaps he understood. Perhaps he didn't. It no longer mattered. Ayanna had learned long ago that true power didn't demand attention. It moved underneath, silent until the ground shifted. She looked down at her notes again, now mostly unreadable from the water spill, the ink smudged and lines blurred. She didn't care. Those papers were no longer the most important text she carried. She could recite her keynote from memory, if needed. What mattered now was documentation, evidence. She reopened her phone, began typing a detailed memo of the entire incident, time-stamped and indexed. Not just for herself, but for the attorneys she would call the next morning, for the internal board that would review the flight logs, for the disciplinary committee that would eventually have to decide whether this crew's actions constituted a violation of federal anti-discrimination protocols. As she typed, her expression remained neutral. She had no intention of confronting anyone on this flight again. The system would speak louder. Above her, the overhead lighting flickered slightly as the aircraft adjusted cabin pressure. She felt no turbulence, but there was movement nonetheless, unseen, like her plan. Christine passed again, paused slightly near row 3, and stole a glance back toward Ayanna's seat. Ayanna didn't move. She let her stillness speak. No reaction, no words, but the message was already sent. Christine's gaze lingered a moment too long, unease flickering across her polished expression before she turned sharply away. The airline uniform might have still adorned her body, but the authority in that aisle had shifted. Slowly, with unassuming grace, Ayanna crossed her legs, wiped her fingers dry with the last clean corner of her napkin, and reached into her bag for a second device, a corporate-issued tablet with secure access. She began uploading files, photos, time-stamped messages, descriptions of the interactions, even the steward's exact words, "Oops," and the phrase that still rang in her ear from earlier, "We thought you weren't coming back." A pattern was forming, one that would be easy to prove in hindsight. She was crafting a case, not out of vengeance, but necessity. If she didn't act, then who would speak for the next woman who sat in 2A? For the one who didn't have boardroom access or legal counsel on speed dial? This wasn't just about her anymore. That realization grounded her like nothing else had. Somewhere across the aisle, the child who had questioned her presence had fallen asleep, head lolling against his mother's shoulder. The mother had not looked her way again. Ayanna glanced at them once, just long enough to remind herself of the power of perception and how early it took root. She knew the boy wouldn't remember her face tomorrow, but she would remember his voice forever. It had echoed with inherited bias, not taught explicitly, but passed down in silence. She turned back to her tablet, completed her notes, and began composing a private memo to a trusted colleague on the compliance board. The subject line was simple: passenger discrimination, immediate review recommended. When she hit save, the draft auto-synced to cloud storage. Redundancy was key. By the time the plane landed, the data would exist in 3 encrypted systems, all secured against deletion. Ayanna closed the tablet and leaned back. Her blouse had dried by now, though it left a faint ring of discoloration where the water had soaked through. She didn't bother fixing it. It was part of the record. Her badge was still clipped inside her bag, the polished metal faintly catching the light as the screen beside her flickered into sleep mode. Instead, the cockpit door opened. It was rare, nearly unheard of mid-flight, but the pilot, an older man with weathered eyes and a calm, deliberate walk, stepped into the cabin. Passengers turned out of habit, curiosity leading them to glance toward the cockpit, a few adjusting in their seats to see what was happening. The pilot didn't carry authority with his uniform alone. His posture, his tone when he greeted row 1, his ease as he gave a brief comment about smooth conditions and tailwinds, these things conveyed control. It was standard, a gesture for premium cabin passengers on certain long-haul flights, something to add charm and rapport. But today, it became something else entirely. As he reached Ayanna's row, he nodded toward her seatmate, then glanced toward her. His eyes were kind, but tired, the way most pilots looked after years in the air. And something about the moment, the stillness of the aisle, the lingering sting of being overlooked, mocked, and dismissed, compelled Ayanna to rise. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden movement, no aggression, just calm intent. She stood slowly, placing her hands by her sides, meeting the pilot's eyes with composure that startled even herself. Her voice, when it came, was clear, steady, and unshakable. "Dr. Ayanna Whitlow," she said, enunciating each word with quiet authority. "Trauma Chief, Boston Medical. I'm here as a keynote speaker for the National Trauma Response Summit in San Diego." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The silence that followed expanded like a vacuum. Conversations paused. Forks hovered midair. Screens dimmed. A ripple passed through the cabin like an invisible shockwave. For a heartbeat, the space was still. The name had been spoken plainly, yet it carried the weight of something undeniable. The pilot blinked, and to his credit, didn't falter. "Dr. Whitlow," he said, repeating it like he was confirming it with himself. "It's good to have you with us." She nodded once, nothing more. She didn't elaborate. She didn't explain the indignities. That wasn't the point. The point was to place herself back into the narrative with the authority that had been stripped from her since the plane left Boston. To no longer be the silent, invisible victim in seat 2A. She returned to her seat as quietly as she'd stood, but the weight of that moment didn't leave the air. It hovered. It settled into the minds of everyone who'd heard. The pilot returned to the cockpit without another word. And then from just behind her, in row 3, a voice broke the stunned silence. "Wait," a man said, leaning forward, squinting. "Are you Dr. Whitlow?" From the 2022 Miami pileup. His tone was incredulous, bordering on reverent. Ayanna turned slightly, not surprised but deeply aware of what was happening. "My cousin," the man continued, his voice rising so others could hear, "was in that wreck. You were the one they airlifted in to stabilize the scene. You're the reason he's walking." His tone grew louder, energized. "You saved lives. I remember your name all over the news. Everyone did." A murmur swept through the rows now, spreading outward like a dropped pebble in still water. Passengers whispered, leaned into each other, checked their phones. A woman across the aisle opened a search engine and began typing. Another in row 1 turned slowly and said, "I think I saw her TED Talk about field trauma integration." Ayanna didn't respond. She didn't need to. Recognition had already begun. She didn't want fame. That wasn't her goal. She hadn't stood to be acknowledged or praised. But the shift, the complete reversal of perception from invisible to invaluable, was palpable. Christine, who stood near the forward galley, froze. Her lips parted slightly. For the first time since boarding, uncertainty crossed her face. The young male steward hovered behind the cart, awkwardly adjusting the cups. Neither spoke. Neither moved. They didn't need to. The shift in the cabin did all the speaking. Ayanna sat again, carefully placing her tablet back into her bag. Her hands were still, her heartbeat steady. For the first time in hours, she felt a small measure of peace. Not because she'd been recognized, not because someone had spoken in her defense, but because she had reclaimed her identity on her own terms. It had taken one sentence. No anger, no outrage, just truth. That was all it took to begin turning the tide. She didn't look at Christine. She didn't glance at the steward. Their silence was enough. Their stillness spoke volumes. The passengers, once indifferent, now leaned into her presence, recalibrating their understanding of who sat in 2A. She was no longer the subject of whispered ridicule. Now she was a name, a legacy. The quiet reverence began to fill the vacuum left by earlier scorn. A woman from 1C leaned across the aisle and whispered something to her partner, both nodding slowly. The man who had defended Ayanna earlier gave her a subtle nod of confirmation, like he now fully understood what he had instinctively supported. Even the mother of the curious child looked down, face tinged with discomfort. It wasn't guilt, at least not yet, but awareness. And for Ayanna, that was enough. Though Ayanna made no attempt to bask in their shifting admiration, she noticed the change as precisely as she'd observed the earlier contempt. Eyes that had once avoided hers now flicked toward her with uncertain reverence, as if trying to reconcile the woman they'd seen mocked with a name that now carried meaning. It wasn't the name alone that altered the atmosphere. It was the truth behind it. Her record, her accomplishments, her rank, her authority, all of which had existed the moment she boarded the plane, but had been buried under assumptions and quiet cruelty. She hadn't demanded acknowledgement. She had revealed it. And that truth now hovered like a reckoning none of them could outrun. The silence from the crew was perhaps the most telling shift of all. Christine, the stewardess whose arrogance had driven much of the pain Ayanna endured, now lingered at the galley like a forgotten prop, her movement stiff, her posture uncertain. The young male steward moved more cautiously now, eyes lowered, manner subdued, perhaps hoping to vanish from the memory being crafted in real time. But the memory wasn't vanishing. It was becoming permanent. The man in row 3, the one who had recognized her, had pulled out his phone after the revelation. At first, Ayanna ignored it, thinking he was searching news articles to confirm his statement. But then she noticed him lifting the phone again, holding it steady in landscape mode. His voice was quiet but firm as he spoke into the lens. "This is Dr. Ayanna Whitlow," he said, panning slowly toward her seat. "She saved my cousin's life after the Miami pileup in 2022. She's the trauma chief at Boston Medical. But the airline crew on this flight denied her access to the bathroom, humiliated her in front of passengers, spilled water on her, called her entitled. They tried to erase her dignity because they assumed she didn't belong. This is what racism looks like at 36,000 feet. He didn't shout. He didn't pan dramatically. He was methodical, deliberate, damning. Several passengers turned their heads now, visibly uncomfortable. A few looked toward the crew as if expecting some intervention, but none came. Christine's face paled visibly. The male steward disappeared behind the curtain. The man recording didn't stop. "I want the world to see how easily people in power abuse it," he added, "and how quickly perception changes when they realize who they've mistreated. That's Dr. Whitlow. Look her up. You'll know what she's done, and you'll know what they did to her." He stopped recording, typed rapidly, and hit send. Ayanna didn't ask where he posted it. She didn't need to. The internet moved fast, and his tone told her everything. This wasn't a private message to friends. It was a broadcast, a digital witness account already on its way to platforms that would devour and amplify it within moments. She heard the subtle vibration of devices all around her, notifications chiming, fingers scrolling, eyes widening. She felt it before she confirmed it. The video was already spreading. And then her own phone buzzed. Once, then twice. She pulled it from her bag and checked the screen. The first notification was from GC Langley. The preview read simply, "Review complete. Draft in progress." She opened the secure app and read the message that followed. It was short, clinical, devastating. Received full incident log and supporting files. Satellite Wi-Fi confirms passenger uploads and independent witness recordings match manifest timestamps. Early legal projection suggests settlement class action potential. Current estimated damages, $3.1 billion. She exhaled slowly, not in surprise, but in confirmation. The figure wasn't a threat. It was an assessment, the number born of accumulated infractions, contractual violations, federal noncompliance, and reputational harm. She had documented everything, and now others had unknowingly added to the ledger. The steward's spilled water, the child's question, the crew's dismissal, the recorded statement from a passenger. Each had become a line in a case that was building momentum with the force of a legal avalanche. The words class action stood out like a flashing beacon. This wasn't just about her anymore. It hadn't been for some time. Now, the case was expansive. Other passengers who had suffered quietly, unseen, would soon find voice in her documentation. The discrimination would be mapped, filed, challenged in court. The number was only a beginning, but the real victory would be structural change. Ayanna knew this path. She'd navigated it before, not in airplanes, but in boardrooms, hospitals, and policy panels. She had rewritten protocols. She had forced institutions to look in mirrors they'd spent decades avoiding. And now, an airline was about to become the latest reflection. Her fingers hovered over the screen a moment longer before she typed a simple reply. Confirmed. Proceed. Delay no filings punto. The response came instantly. Understood. Deposition requests begin upon landing. Media advisory in standby. She powered off the device, not out of fear or secrecy, but control. The next steps were already in motion. Nothing more needed to be said. The cabin had gone unusually quiet. Even the children seemed subdued, their natural restlessness replaced by a tension they couldn't name. Ayanna noticed a woman in first-class glance toward her, then quietly slide her phone into her bag with trembling hands. Her face was flushed. She'd likely seen the video or a repost, and now sat trying to reconcile her silence with the truth that had been exposed. Others had turned back to their screens, but they weren't watching movies. They were scrolling, reading, catching up. Ayanna leaned back into her seat, the leather pressing gently against her shoulders. The dampness on her blouse had dried completely now, leaving only the faintest residue of the steward's negligence. It no longer mattered. That moment, humiliating, cruel, was now archived in video and voice. It had become evidence, and soon justice. The phones continued to buzz faintly, notifications, reposts, messages flying through the digital air with the same velocity that carried the aircraft. Somewhere on the ground, the video recorded by the man behind her had found momentum. It had been picked up by accounts with reach, reposted with outrage, framed with hashtags, and soon it would be impossible for anyone to claim ignorance. Her name, her credentials, her face, everything was out there now, not because she sought it, but because truth demanded it. At the front of the cabin, just ahead of the bulkhead, Christine stood frozen near the galley, whispering urgently to the young male steward. Their posture had changed. Gone were the rigid spines and dismissive gestures. Now they stood like students caught cheating mid-exam, unsure whether to deny or apologize, waiting for instructions. That moment came sooner than they expected. The cockpit door opened again, not slowly, not ceremoniously, but with intent. This time, it wasn't the pilot stepping out. It was the co-pilot, a woman with short cropped hair and a face made of sharp lines and clear directives. She didn't glance at passengers. She didn't make small talk. Her eyes swept directly toward the flight crew, and her expression didn't waver. She said something quietly to the male steward, too low to hear, and handed him a folded document. Whatever she said turned the blood from his face. He nodded, not once, but twice, then stepped back into the galley and disappeared. Christine followed. No word spoken. No excuses made. Moments later, the intercom beeped. One of those short tones that meant an official announcement was coming, but this time, it wasn't a cheerful voice or safety reminder. The pilot himself came on the line, his voice measured and professional, but now laced with something unmistakable: gravity. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this is your captain speaking. We want to inform all passengers that a preliminary internal incident report has been filed with federal oversight in real time. Due to circumstances aboard this flight, a review has been initiated and will proceed upon landing." There was a pause, brief, intentional. Then he added, "This does not affect the safety of the flight, and we appreciate your cooperation and professionalism as we continue toward our destination." The intercom clicked off. The weight of his words sat heavily over every row. In-flight federal oversight. That was not a phrase anyone heard often, and certainly not for minor issues. The message was clear. The airline knew what had happened. And more importantly, someone in command had chosen not to cover it up. A different kind of silence fell now, not awkward or indifferent, but stunned, reactive. Passengers who had stayed neutral, who had looked away during Ayana's mistreatment, now sat stiff in their seats, suddenly hyper-aware of what their silence might have cost them. No one wanted to be on the wrong side of a federal complaint, especially not in a digital age where everything had been recorded. Row 5, which had remained relatively quiet the entire flight, suddenly stirred. A man in business attire leaned out into the aisle, holding his phone like a badge. "You're all going viral," he said, not loud, but not discreet either. "Might want to start saying sorry before this becomes a Netflix documentary." A ripple of awkward chuckles followed. Nervous laughter from people who didn't quite know how to respond. Some looked down. A few nodded. Christine did not emerge. Neither did the steward. The cabin crew had become ghosts in their own domain. Ayana didn't smile. This wasn't victory. Not yet. It was simply the truth doing what it always does, surfacing. She opened her phone again, not to check headlines or monitor the video spread, but to respond to a new message from Langley. The legal team had moved with stunning speed. Case file created. 3 other passengers submitting corroborating statements post-landing. Federal inquiry expected within 72 hours. Media escalation underway. Board of directors notified. Expect public apology by midday. She replied with a single word: proceed. Ayana had always believed that justice, true justice, wasn't reactive. It was methodical. And that's what this had become. A methodical unraveling of every insult, every denial, every smug smirk, turned now into liability and exposure. The passengers knew it. The crew knew it. Even the child from earlier, now quiet and wide-eyed, seemed to sense something had changed. His mother, who had said nothing earlier, now placed a gentle hand on his head and glanced toward Ayana, not with guilt, but with something closer to respect. It was too late for correction, but perhaps not too late for understanding. Ayana folded her hands in her lap again and watched the clouds roll past the window. The sun had crested the horizon now, casting soft gold across the clouds like a blanket of quiet fire. It seemed fitting. Light, finally, after hours of quiet cruelty and calculated suppression. And above it all, the plane continued forward, steady, unaffected by the storm it now carried within its walls. Aboard that flight, reputations were shifting. Documents were compiling. The landing was smooth, as though the turbulence of injustice and reckoning had stayed trapped in the cabin while the plane descended in perfect, practiced calm. The wheels touched down with a faint jolt, and the engines roared into a deceleration that pulled everyone slightly forward, jolting them back into reality. San Diego's sunlight spilled through the oval windows as if offering a fresh lens through which this journey's ending might be seen. But for Ayana, it wasn't an ending. It was a necessary passage, one that had broken something open, not in her, but around her. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, the usual scramble of movement began. Seat belts clicked, bags were tugged from under seats, passengers began standing, eager to reclaim the ground beneath their feet. But the atmosphere remained oddly reverent. Those nearest Ayana moved with caution, eyes averted, words muted, as if afraid to break something sacred that had emerged in flight. She stayed seated calm, unmoved, her carry-on neatly zipped, her satchel strapped over one shoulder. She waited, not because she had to, but because she was no longer in a rush. The fight had moved forward now, beyond the rows of this aircraft. Ahead of her, near the galley where most crew now stood waiting, Christine emerged. Her posture was stiff but uncertain, no longer the confident gatekeeper of the lavatory, no longer the woman who had smirked while water soaked Ayana's clothes. Her face was pale, eyes swollen at the corners from a mix of fatigue and something closer to fear. She clutched a clipboard, but her fingers trembled around it. As Ayana stepped into the aisle, Christine took a half step forward and then froze. There was a pause, a beat. The sound of luggage wheels and shuffling passengers faded under the gravity of what passed between them. Christine's lips parted, but no words came. Then she tried again. "I didn't know who you were," she whispered. Her voice cracked, not from insincerity, but from the dawning understanding of what she'd done, not just to a woman in 2A, but to herself. Ayana's gaze didn't waver. Her voice was low, steady, and unflinchingly honest. "You didn't need to." It wasn't anger. It wasn't bitterness. It was a fact, heavy and irrefutable. Respect should never require credentials. Dignity should never depend on recognition. The truth landed harder than any rebuke ever could. Christine's eyes dropped. The clipboard lowered. And then Ayana walked past her, through the jet bridge, into the terminal bathed in soft California light. There were no reporters, no flashbulbs, no applause, and she didn't need any. The real victory had already taken flight. 3 months later, in a quiet training room tucked inside an airline operations center in Atlanta, Christine stood in front of a dozen new hires, her uniform freshly pressed, her badge clipped neatly to her blouse. Her voice was different now, lower, more grounded. Not mechanical, not performative, just real. Behind her, a screen displayed words that were now part of every new hire briefing. Equity, dignity, accountability. Christine pointed to the words without dramatic flourish. She didn't smile for effect. "Respect isn't about knowing someone's title," she told the group. "It's about seeing their humanity the second they walk on board. Every person, every seat." Her words landed with unexpected weight. One trainee, a young woman with a skeptical brow, raised her hand. "Did something happen that made you say that?" Christine hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Yes, something I'll never forget, and someone I'll never forget." She didn't name Ayana. She didn't need to. The lesson was in her voice, in the shift in her posture, in the way her hands no longer shook when she handed out policies. She had gone through something, and she had come out changed. Meanwhile, in Boston, Ayana stood before a packed auditorium at a university guest lecture, her voice as strong as ever, though gentler at its edges. "In trauma medicine, we're taught to look past what's visible," she told the students. The external wound isn't always the most dangerous one. It's the internal damage, the kind that hides in silence, that changes everything. She paused, letting that truth settle. And that's not just in medicine. That's life. Her students nodded, many of them young, diverse, full of a kind of hunger for change that had driven Ayanna her entire life. She didn't tell them the airplane story. That wasn't what defined her. But the wisdom from it, quietly, deliberately, had become part of her work, part of how she mentored, taught, and moved through the world. Back in San Diego, the airline issued a formal apology, public, sweeping, and broadcast across news networks and corporate bulletins. Christine's name was never mentioned, nor Ayanna's, but the message was unmistakable. Training protocols changed. Sensitivity modules were updated. And in boardrooms, executives who had once believed discrimination could be quietly handled began to see it as a seismic threat to reputation, to profits, to truth. The $3.1 billion class action suit proceeded steadily through the courts. Statements poured in from former passengers, some referencing events similar to Ayanna's, others newly emboldened to speak. But Ayanna never chased headlines. She let the evidence speak, just as she had let the moment speak on that flight. Justice wasn't always loud. Sometimes it moved like water, quiet, persistent, shaping stone over time. And on a crisp autumn morning, as Ayanna walked through the halls of her hospital, past new interns and grateful families, she paused at the photo wall that listed past award winners in disaster response. Her own image was there, of course, smiling, poised, but she didn't linger on it. Instead, she glanced to the empty wall beside it, soon to be filled by the next generation. A nurse passed her, smiling. "Morning, Dr. Whitlow," she said. Ayanna nodded, returned the smile, and moved on. Because the true reward of surviving injustice wasn't just the victory. It was ensuring that no one else would have to survive it the same way again. The end. Thanks for reading. If you found the story powerful or thought-provoking, consider giving it a like and subscribing for more. I'd love to hear what you think. What part of the story hit hardest? Which twist surprised you the most? And where are you watching or reading from? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it. Your feedback helps shape the next journey.